Hello, welcome to the Go Higher Frequency Astrology channel. My name is Suzanne. Join me as I investigate the monthly moon cycles and other important transits as I attempt to create some order out of this chaos. In each episode, it's my hope to dial into where we can focus our energies more productively. Well, we've had quite a few violent flare-ups in the US since this Leo new moon, with Mars conjoining the South Node in Virgo, ruled by a Mercury retrograde in Leo. I've had my own confrontations as this Mars opposed my natal Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Pisces, and Mercury in Leo opposed my natal Mercury in Aquarius. Did you know that medical insurance companies can claw back money from claims that they paid out nearly 2 years ago? That was one such confrontation. How about you? Did you have to confront something in order to move forward? Mars is called a malefic for a good reason. But at the end of the day, Mars is just symbolic of our internal drives. And it can be both harmful or helpful depending on how conscious we are of these drives. Now, one of the more unexpected announcements that happened on the day of the new moon was Macron announcing that France was going to recognize Palestine as a state. And this was going to be an official announcement during the next UN meeting. It just so happens to be in between the two eclipses in September. Now, interestingly, France's natal sun is at 29 degrees Virgo, the degree of the upcoming solar eclipse. And Macron has his natal sun, Mercury, at 29 degrees Sagittarius in square aspect to this eclipse. Since this announcement, there has been mounting public backlash against Israel about the mass starvation that is being inflicted upon the Palestinian people. Now let's talk about this full moon. Even though we don't have any out-of-bounds planets in this full moon, thank God, this is promising to be one of the most impactful full moons of the year. This is the third of 3 cusp full moons before the full moon eclipse in September. According to human design, these full moons are considered bridges to the other side. The first one was during the Sagittarius full moon. It was on the president's natal full moon in his 4th, 10th house axis. It was on the fixed cross of possession. If you remember, it's all mine. Everything's mine. The second one was the full moon in Capricorn. This was near his natal Saturn, which is intercepted in the 11th house. It was on the fixed cross of beginnings. This is the kid in the schoolyard that says, on your mark, get set, go. And everybody runs and they don't. Now we are at the last of the 3 cusp full moons, the Aquarius full moon, aspecting his Mars-Pluto midpoint in the 12th house. It's on the fixed cross of interaction. This is the person who says, I know what's good for you. You can never go against these people. You can never win. You always lose. This full moon chart shows that there is an exhaustion from this drama and uncertainty in the world, and therefore a certain abdication and appeasement from our partnerships, a desire to sidestep or ignore any obstacles in favor of harmony. I see the sidestepping as a certain type of subversive surrendering, like ABC, who settled with the administration, but then dropped that South Park episode mocking the president the very next day. And I see that many organizations are sidestepping the administration in other ways too, like simply changing the positioning of their DEI program so they won't be called out and get in trouble. This full moon is what Raven Caldera calls the friendship moon, which is about our friendships, our allies. She says this about this full moon. Those who are born on the friendship moon have a deep need for networks of social contact. They will instinctively put their friends before other relationships. Social capital is more than just a theory to them. It really is their wealth. When they're down, it is that network of social capital that they turn to. They don't need FaceTime to consider someone a friend, and they happily carry on multitudes of long-distance relationships. They do tend to spread themselves thin among friends unless they're in trouble and leaning on one particular bond. But even though there's a certain amount of abdication and appeasement during this full moon, There's also a very targeted display of power in this chart, indicating an eruption of sorts, a single-minded confrontation that bubbles to the surface all of a sudden, setting off the energy of this kite formation. Someone or something is rising from obscurity to make an impact on our current trajectory. This full moon is related to the new moon that happened on February 9th, 2024. And I want to point out just a couple of things that caught my eye during that period. During that new moon period, there were a lot of new releases and announcements related to AI. It was also a bullish month for crypto, driven primarily by a strong performance of Bitcoin. And now we see further developments in these areas as the president has signed the Genius Act into law and has promised little regulation for AI in the US. There was also discussions about the existential threat of Russia deploying weapons of mass destruction in space, as well as increasing tension and strikes by the US and Iran, Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, largely stemming from the ongoing Israel and Hamas war. So now with Saturn and Neptune at the apex of this kite aspect, which is conjunct the midheaven at the final degree of Pisces and Mars on the IC directly opposing, we can see this existential threat more vividly. The president just narrowed his deadline to Putin to just about the time of this full moon. And as we just discussed, there's also mounting pressure on Israel. And Israel seems hell-bent to displace the Palestinian people. They're certainly not keen on the idea of a Palestinian state. So let's look at this chart more closely. And I specifically want to look at this chart in relation to the Sibley chart. I don't do this every time, but it's important, I think, for this full moon since the IC and MC are virtually flipped. Now, this chart has zero Earth in it, save the South Node. So it's important that we find ways to ground ourselves if needed. It'll be difficult to focus on practicalities or material manifestation during this full moon. It's more important to focus on inquiry. What are our values? So we can find a path forward and stop roaming around in all different directions. It is clear that if we want to be victorious, we'll need to fight. Now, there's a lot of abdication going on right now, but we cannot expect to be victorious if we don't put in the effort. If we could all see ourselves from a larger whole, there wouldn't be a need for fighting, but we are not there yet, unfortunately. So use this full moon for inquiry, to figure out your values, to find the best path forward, then be prepared to put in your best effort to fight for the direction you want to head. Now, in relation to the Sibley chart, it shows the United States is undergoing an intense period of internal economic revolution and self-redefinition, characterized by aggressive governmental action and a deep reevaluation of our foundations. The full moon in Aquarius in the second house, just past a Pluto return, is a culmination or climax of the revolutionary shift of our national wealth and resources, demonstrated in large part to these tariffs that we're starting to implement, and that bill that transfers the country's wealth away from shared resources to the most wealthy. The public is deeply engaged with calling for innovative, collective, or technologically driven economic models. Now, we're all split on which way we should go, but we want something different. We know we cannot keep going in this direction. Now, this period is exposing hidden power dynamics and will likely lead to a complete dismantling and rebuilding of our existing financial systems. This is starting to happen, but it will be much more extensive as we move forward. We have not seen the dismantling as much as we will see in the months ahead. The Sun and Mercury retrograde in Leo in the 8th house indicates a bright light is shining on our issues with our national debt, our shared international resources, and major financial agreements. It was quite surprising to see that an agreement was pushed through with the EU during this Mercury retrograde. But then there was some news that came out that the details were a bit fuzzy around these agreements. And there was some surprise with what's being said about these agreements from what we say has been negotiated versus what the other country says has been negotiated. So until they're pinned and legal, I wouldn't trust anything that's called out in the media because they're not set in stone. And especially with the EU, as we're still renegotiating some of the terms. Leadership's role will be central and extensive renegotiations and debates are expected. Now, Uranus and Gemini in the 6th house means that our daily life is being disrupted by the ongoing technological and systemic changes that are happening in our government as we strive to reinvent ourselves both economically and ideologically. Now, we're not all in agreement, and there are multiple paths forward, as Uranus and Gemini indicates. Pete Buttigieg was just in the news warning Democrats that they couldn't go back to the status quo after Trump. What's been dismantled cannot be taped back up like we tried to do during the Biden administration. They must be reinvented anew. The kite pattern shows us taking decisive and assertive action with Mars on the MC in response to profound financial shifts that we may start to feel in a bigger way with this full moon. The government will be proactive, perhaps even confrontational, in implementing new policies to address the current economic revolution. Our nation's very foundations, or the IC, are simultaneously undergoing a deep, complex reevaluation with Saturn and Neptune both retrograde. There's confusion or a dismantling of old beliefs about our national identity and security due to past deceptions or the emergence of new idealized visions for our country. The sextiles from Pluto in Aquarius and Uranus in Gemini reinforce that this economic revolution is directly fueling the governmental actions and foundational shifts. How this plays out at the end of the day is still up for grabs, so don't lose hope. As a standalone chart located in Washington, D.C., the MC-IC axis at the 29th degree of Pisces Virgo is significant in a couple of ways. As I mentioned, the upcoming solar eclipse will be at 29 degrees of Virgo, and Saturn and then Neptune will move back to the 29th degree in Pisces, with Neptune's final visit of that degree for 165 years. That 29th degree of Pisces, which is the MC of this chart, is conjunct the fixed star Shet, which is known as the disaster star. It is associated with storms and tidal waves. Its broader lesson is about staying conscious amidst the chaos that we are experiencing around us right now. Finding your center, your North Star, and letting that guide you. Now, the angles of this chart are identical to the December 30th new moon in Capricorn chart we had right before the new administration took office. If you want to look back at my delineation of that chart, I encourage you to do so. I'm going to do so myself. And I remember pointing out that the descendants degree was exactly conjunct the degree of the Democratic Party's sun. And in that chart, Neptune and the North Node was on the midheaven, and it was part of a mystical rectangle. In that previous chart, Mars was retrograde in Leo in the 1st house, and it was opposing a direct Pluto in Aquarius. And now Mercury is retrograde in Leo, opposing a retrograde Pluto. Now, if you remember during that time, the administration was raring to go, but they couldn't fully move forward because they were waiting on that inauguration. And, you know, the plutocrats were ready to go. They were ready for a new administration that would strip all of the regulations that the Democratic Party was starting to implement on their AI technologies. they thought that these regulations would slow them down, would make them less competitive, and they didn't want all of these regulations. So they backed this administration and they were ready to negotiate all of these things. And now with Mercury retrograde and Pluto retrograde, we're reviewing not only the administration's policies, are they getting us to where we wanted to go, why we voted them into office, but also the regulations for this technology. Is this the right way to go? Is it safe for us to move forward without certain regulations? During the new moon in Capricorn, there was news about China hacking the treasury, and Jimmy Carter had died, and we had the South Korean plane crash. Now, since then, there's been more hacks to our government. St. Paul just had a major hack to its government, which is being looked into. And the Democratic Party has been under review. It's been repeatedly attacked for not coming forward to fight this administration more aggressively. And more specifically related to that plane crash, there's been many plane crashes since then. But the most damaging one, the most significant one, was India's plane crash. And there's been a lot of updates about pilot errors that have happened since then. In the Korean plane crash, it was that they turned off the less damaged engine after a bird strike. And in the India plane crash, it was a different type of plane, but they basically blamed it on one of the pilots being suicidal. So it was sort of a stretch to blame it on that pilot. But there were some recordings of that pilot asking the other one, did you turn off the engine? So they immediately blamed it on pilot error. But just recently, there was another plane that had engine failure, and the pilots were able to navigate that plane to safety, but it was the same type of plane that crashed in India. And the engine had basically stopped as they were going to take off. So as they managed to steer the plane to safety, it calls into question about this engine failure. So it's the same conflict between who's to blame and these people who have interests in not being called out. They're pointing to these reasons, they're jumping to conclusions, but it's a lot more complex than that. And the powers that be want to scapegoat somebody when it's more complex, the blame. We want people to pay for systemic errors in our values. Boeing, they wanted to be more productive. They wanted to please their investors. So, they did a lot of things that were based on becoming more efficient. And instead, that impacted some of the mechanisms of their planes to make them less safe. And so right now, I think we're under that same investigation. We want to tear off regulations. We want to blame all of these people when it's a systemic error based on our value system. And so I think that's something that is coming or has the opportunity to come into more consciousness right now. We can use that as an opportunity to really understand, what kinds of regulations are needed, but really from a place of values. What are our values? Are we ready to champion this money-making mechanisms, put less regulations, and in order to accomplish what at the end of the day? What are we moving toward? Are we concerned more about the collective or a very small percentage of people? And it's interesting because the opening sun moon square that is happening on August 1st is the day that I'm releasing this video, so I don't know what's actually going to happen. It's related to that new moon that happened right before the election on November 1st. It's actually in square relationship to Vance's sun. It's on the cross of the four ways. And so Vance might be in the news on August 1st. But it's really interesting because we're reviewing all of these disasters and scandals at this time. And we're finding out that these people have let us down because they've used these scandals to pin the blame, to deflect the blame on themselves and to pin it on other people. There's been a lot of deception happening, and it's not clear cut. You know, there are people that have been championing this scandal who also might have been deeply a part of this scandal. This mechanism that's been around for a long time that has enabled rich people to basically take advantage of those less fortunate, to prostitute young women for their pleasure. It is a culture that has enabled this. It's not one person, it's many people. And you can't just find that one person that's guilty. It is so complex because there are so many people involved. And it really depends on people's wealth and what they get away with or what they don't. And that's become a big problem for the average person because it's not fair, unfortunately. And so I think we're all reviewing this as a culture. It's about our culture's values and what we're okay with. So if we want to change something, we have to come into an agreement as a society as to what's okay and what's not okay, because it bleeds into everything. You know, they talk about this deep state, but each party comes in and they become the issue. They become the deep state. It really isn't about a party. It's about how we enable a culture to feed into certain advantages for certain people at the expense of others. So we're all reviewing this right now. And what's going on in the world and how people have been through certain atrocious events are now becoming the fathers that did that to them, because it's a cycle. And at some point, we become those horrible fathers because we justify what we're doing to ourselves. So there's not one guilty party, but the people who get away with it are the people who have money, who are privileged, who have more power, who have more weapons. And so if we don't all collectively decide that this is not okay any longer, it's just going to keep cycling through power. And we really have to watch this in ourselves too, because it's not just the people at the top, but we do this every single day, you know, in our own lives. So I think it's really important to become more conscious of the ways that you operate in this world and how you justify certain things. We need to really shine the light on how we're involved in these systems, these systemic systems that enable these disasters and enable these scandals. And I think as a collective, we have the opportunity to see this and for that to raise in more consciousness to see the other side. And that's the beauty of this time, I think. And you can find the beauty in the rose bush in a garbage dump, finding that beauty out of this disaster that's happened. You know, where are we made to be more conscious based on all of the chaos that is going on around us? Where can we become conscious? And I think this full moon is going to be a step in that direction. A certain amount of us will become more conscious and a certain amount of us will stay asleep, because that's how the world works. But I hope you use this opportunity to become more conscious of the ways that you are part of the system and that you're a part of blaming and justifying. I think that there's a real beauty in that. Sometimes other people need traumatic events to help them become more conscious. We have to be shocked into it sometimes, unfortunately. And hopefully we'll get there without something more nefarious happening. Anything can happen. And I pray for safety. And I pray that we'll all get through this very difficult time. Thanks. Bye.